If you have not watched part 1 of this story, please go and watch it first, because what happens in this room, what is said between these people and what grows from it across the months that follow, will mean so much more to you if you know everything that brought them to this doorstep. In part 1 we watched Ifeoma, a 23-year-old woman who had been carrying her family since 18, who had worked in Obiora and Wosu's house for 3 years without once eating a single thing that was not hers, take 2 bread rolls and a container of rice and 3 pieces of fruit that were going in the waste bin before noon. We watched Obiora fire her in 2 minutes without asking a single question. We watched her walk out through the back door she had used every morning for 3 years with her hands shaking and her head down, and no argument and no explanation because there was nothing to say. And then we watched Obiora spend the rest of the morning turning his coffee cup in slow circles on his desk while something sat in his chest that logic could not identify and could not move. We watched him get Ifeoma's address from the staff records and drive to a part of the city he had never been to before. We watched him stand on a dusty doorstep with his hand raised to knock and hear through a thin wooden door the things that had been true all along and that he had not known because he had never once asked. The coat she had sold the week before. The medication bottles she had shaken that morning and counted by sound. The numbers that kept not adding up. And her voice, very quiet, saying it just seemed so wrong. The food going in the bin. It just seemed so wrong. And then he raised his hand again and knocked. And the door opened. And that is exactly where we are right now. Stay with me. Because what happens inside this room is going to change everything. Welcome back to Bishop Tales. If you are new here, please subscribe right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from tonight. We love knowing where our family is. This is part 2. Let us continue. The woman who opened the door was everything the voice through the thin wood had suggested and more. Small and white-haired and slightly curved at the shoulders in the way of tall people after years of living, with eyes that were the sharpest thing in her face, brown and warm and entirely unimpressed by whatever Obiora and Wosu looked like standing on her doorstep in his suit. She looked at him with the complete and unhurried attention of someone who has been reading people for 7 decades and has developed from that practice a quality of perception that most people spend their whole lives trying to acquire without success. She was not hostile. She was simply accurate. She let nothing pass through those eyes unexamined. He said his name. He said that Ifeoma worked for him, and the past tense arrived in the sentence before he had fully decided to put it there, and she heard it with the specific precision of someone who notices things. He said he had come because. He stopped. The sentence did not complete itself. He started again. He said he would like to come in if that was acceptable. She looked at him for one more moment, a complete and final assessment that arrived at its conclusion cleanly. Then she stepped back from the door. Ifeoma was standing in the middle of the room when he entered. She had heard his name at the door. She was standing very still with her hands at her sides and the expression of someone who has been practicing composure for years and is currently requiring every bit of that practice. The tension in her body was visible in the particular way that careful people's tension is visible, not in movement but in its opposite, in the specific quality of stillness that takes effort. Her eyes met his and held for a moment and then moved away and then came back. She said nothing. There was nothing yet available to say. He looked around the room. It was the size of his office on the 2nd floor of his house, perhaps slightly smaller. A low sofa against one wall with its original fabric worn through in places, covered now with a clean cloth that had been pressed flat and smoothed with care. A small wooden table with 2 chairs. A shelf carrying a few books and a framed photograph, a woman younger than the one who had opened the door sitting with a small child on her lap, both of them squinting into light coming from somewhere off the edge of the picture. A single bulb on the ceiling. In the corner a kitchen space built from what was available and arranged by someone who understood that how you organize the things you have says something about who you are. A 2-burner gas stove. A blue water container. Several pots hanging above the stove on nails, each one positioned with deliberate care, their handles pointing in the same direction, their surfaces clean. Everything in the room was in its place. Everything was worn. Both of these things were equally true and equally present and equally real. Obiora looked at the room and felt something move in his chest that was not comfortable and was not supposed to be. He looked at Ifeoma. She was still standing with her hands at her sides and her eyes doing the careful work of someone managing what is behind them. He said her name. Her jaw tightened fractionally. He said he had come because he had been wrong. He said it without the cushioning language that people use when they want the admission to be easier on themselves, without the qualifications and the contextualizing that make the person saying sorry feel better at the cost of the person receiving it. He said he had made a decision in 2 minutes about a situation he had not understood and that in those 2 minutes he had not asked a single question about any of the facts of the situation he was deciding about. He said he had heard her through the door. He said he had not meant to hear and that he had heard anyway and that what he heard had made him understand something about the distinction between speed and fairness that he had been confusing his entire professional life and perhaps longer. He looked at the shelf. He looked at the medication bottles on the small table beside the grandmother's chair. 3 orange plastic bottles, the kind you see in hospitals and pharmacies, the kind that he had seen many times in his life and had never once stopped to think about in terms of what it cost to keep them filled and what it meant to the person counting them when they were running low. He looked at the grandmother sitting in her chair near the window, composed and watchful, her sharp eyes on him with the calm of a woman who has seen enough of the world to know that some moments need to be allowed to be what they are without anyone intervening to manage them. He looked at Ifeoma. She was still holding herself together. Her eyes were very bright in the way that eyes are very bright when they are holding something back with considerable effort. And then something happened that Obiora and Wosu had not planned and would not have predicted and could not manage. Something rose from somewhere old and deep inside him that was not available for his usual controls. His eyes filled. He pressed his hand over his mouth. A tear ran down his face. Then another. He stood in the middle of this small clean room in his suit and wept quietly for the first time in front of another person since he was a child. He did not know exactly what he was weeping for. He knew it was not one thing. It was the medication bottles and the coat she had sold and the bread going in the bin and the 3 years of arriving before sunrise and never eating a single thing and the 2 minutes in which he had been wrong and the gap, the enormous gap between the street his house was on and the street he was standing in now, and the fact that the gap had always been there and he had never once looked at it. Nobody spoke for a moment. The room held the 3 of them. Ifeoma very still. The grandmother in her chair with the patient calm of someone who has learned that some moments do their work best when they are simply witnessed rather than shaped. Then the grandmother said, in a voice that was gentle and entirely direct in equal measure, "Sit down, young man." Obiora lowered his hand from his mouth. He looked at her. He nodded once. He sat on the edge of the low sofa and put his hands on his knees and breathed in the specific way that you breathe when you are pulling yourself back from somewhere you had not planned to go. Ifeoma had not moved. She was looking at him now with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously and that he could not fully read. It was not pity. It was not triumph. It was not the comfortable righteous anger that would have been, in some ways, easier for him to receive. It was something more careful and more complicated than any of those things. Something that was genuinely trying to understand what it was looking at. She said, "Can I get you water?" Her voice was quiet and steady and entirely professional. He said no. He said thank you. He said he was fine. A small pause. The grandmother said pleasantly that he did not look fine. Something moved across Ifeoma's face that was not quite a smile and she looked away quickly. Obiora looked at the grandmother. In any other context, a comment like that from someone he did not know would have landed as impertinence. From this small white-haired woman in her chair with her 3 medication bottles and her sharp eyes and her absolute indifference to who he was outside this room, it landed as the truth, which was its own kind of relief. "No," he said. He did not suppose he did. The grandmother nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose diagnosis has been confirmed. "Good," she said. "Uncomfortable is the correct thing to feel in this situation. It means the conscience is still operational. Some people's are not." He stayed for 20 minutes. He understood without being told that he had already used more of their space than he had a right to. He was an uninvited guest in a room that had not asked to receive him and he had no intention of extending his presence beyond what the purpose of his visit required. But in those 20 minutes something happened that he had not experienced in a very long time. He listened. The grandmother talked, and she was a remarkable talker, not the kind that fills silence with noise but the kind that fills it with things worth hearing. She talked about the neighborhood and the families she had watched across her window for years and the tamarind tree in the yard behind them that belonged to an old man too principled to allow anyone else's hand to touch it, so every season the tamarinds fell uncollected and rotted on the ground. Every year, she said with a depth of philosophical sorrow that was entirely genuine, a tragedy. Ifeoma said from the kitchen shelf where she had positioned herself to make tea that they could simply ask him. The grandmother said she had asked him. He had said the tree belonged to his late wife and no other hand should touch what hers had planted. I respect the love, the grandmother said. I do not respect the tamarinds going to waste. Obiora listened and said very little and found to his considerable surprise that saying very little was not uncomfortable. He had spent most of his adult life in rooms where he was the person expected to speak, to define the direction, to shape what happened by the quality of his words and decisions. He had almost entirely forgotten what it felt like to be a guest in someone else's story, to receive rather than direct, to sit in a room where he was not the most important person in it and have that feel not like a diminishment but like a relief. He looked at the photograph on the shelf. He looked at the pots above the stove, arranged with the care of someone for whom the organization of the things she had was a form of dignity that the world could not take from her. He looked at Ifeoma sitting in the chair by the kitchen shelf with her hands folded in her lap, the tension in her shoulders very slowly, almost without her seeming to notice it, beginning to ease. When he stood to leave he paused at the door. He said he would like her to come back to work. If she was willing. She looked at him sharply, the look of someone whose dignity is alert and has decided that this needs to be examined carefully before it is accepted. He said he was not offering it because he felt bad, though he did feel bad and intended to continue feeling bad for the foreseeable future because he had earned the feeling and it was the accurate response to what he had done. He said he was offering it because it was the right thing. He said Adiz would probably leave his employment if he did not and he could not afford to lose Adiz. Something happened in Ifeoma's face, a short genuine exhale of a laugh that arrived before she could catch it. She pressed her lips together quickly. The grandmother said from her chair that the cook sounded like a formidable woman. He said she was. A lighter silence settled. He said the medication costs. He said he wanted to address them. He said before she could speak that this was not charity. He said it was him correcting a wrong. He said if he had not fired her on the evidence of 2 bread rolls and a container of rice she would still have her salary and would be managing. He had taken that from her in 2 minutes and this was him accepting responsibility for those 2 minutes. She said she would think about it. He said that was completely reasonable. He said goodbye to the grandmother. She patted his hand with hers, small and dry and warm, and told him to come back when he was less rumpled, which he thought was probably the most unusual farewell he had ever received. He walked out through the brown door. He went back to his car and sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. The cat was still there on the low wall watching him with the patient interest of something that has decided he is worth watching. He started the engine. He drove back the way he had come, slowly, more aware of the road than he had been on the way out, more aware of everything. Now friends, I need to stop here for just a moment. Because if this story is doing what it should be doing inside you right now, you are feeling something that is worth paying attention to. Please like this video right now and drop a comment below. Tell us what you think should happen next. Tell us what you would have said if you were Ifeoma standing in that room. Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do it now because we have a long way still to go in this story and everything that follows from this room is something you need to see. That evening Obiora sat at his long dining table alone and ate 3 bites of what Adiz had prepared and put his fork down. He called to her. She appeared at the kitchen doorway. He asked whether she had known about the coat. She said she had not known that specifically. She said she had noticed things across the months. The way Ifeoma counted her bus fare in the morning before she left, the quick silent arithmetic of someone for whom the counting was not casual. The way she went still whenever the cost of medical things came up in conversation, a fractional stillness that lasted only a moment before she moved on but that Adiz had learned to read. She said she had found Ifeoma once in the linen room. She had been crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, the specific quiet crying of someone who has chosen a small closed room because they needed 3 minutes and had given themselves exactly that. She had come out and gone directly back to work. Adiz had said nothing. Obiora asked why she had not told him sooner. Adiz was quiet for a moment. She said honestly that she had not been sure he would have wanted to know. The sentence sat in the room. He did not argue with it. He said Ifeoma would be returning. He said her salary would be adjusted upward immediately, a proper adjustment, not a token. He said he wanted Adiz to help him identify the best specialist available in the city for Mama Ngozi's condition, the best oncologist, and that costs were not the consideration. Adiz was quiet for a moment. When she spoke her voice was steady but only just. She said yes sir. She said good night. She went back to the kitchen. He sat alone at the long table for a very long time that night with the house perfectly quiet around him and noticed, for what was perhaps the first time in years, how loud silence could be when you were the only person sitting in it. The following morning Ifeoma's phone rang at 7. It was not her phone because she had sold her phone. It was the old household phone that lived on the shelf, the one kept for emergencies and for the neighborhood group chat that the grandmother monitored with great interest and occasional strong opinions. Ifeoma answered it. Obiora said he hoped it was not too early. She said it was not. She was already up. He said he would like her to come in today if she was willing and they could put the new terms in writing properly so that everything was clear. A pause. He said he had also made some calls that morning about a specialist. He said there was an oncologist at a private hospital whose particular focus was the kind of case Mama Ngozi was dealing with. He said he had arranged a consultation for Thursday if that worked. He said all costs were already arranged. Ifeoma stood in the small kitchen holding the emergency phone and said nothing for a moment. He said her name. She said she was there. She said she would come in at the usual time. Something shifted slightly on the other end of the phone, something that had been held and was now releasing. He said thank you. She ended the call. She stood with the phone still in her hand. Then she turned around. The grandmother was at the small table eating the morning porridge and watching her over the rim of the bowl with eyes that were bright and knowing and had already reached a conclusion. Ifeoma said she was going back. The grandmother nodded with the satisfaction of someone confirming what they had already determined. She asked about the other thing. Ifeoma said he had arranged a specialist consultation for Thursday. Her voice stayed completely steady through this sentence and she was quietly proud of that. The grandmother set her bowl down. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up at Ifeoma with the expression of a woman who has accumulated a great deal of love over 73 years and recognizes it clearly in whatever form it arrives. She said come here. Ifeoma crossed the kitchen and sat beside her and the grandmother took her face in both hands and held it for a long time and looked at her with everything those eyes contained. Then she said she was proud of her. Not for surviving, though the surviving had been extraordinary. Not for working hard, though the working had been harder than anyone should have to work. She said she was proud of her for staying kind through all of it. For not letting any of it make her hard. She said that was the rarest thing and it was entirely hers. The first week back was careful in the way of things that have been broken and are being rebuilt with full knowledge of exactly how the breaking happened. Ifeoma arrived at the usual time. She did her work with the same focused precision she had always brought to it. On the surface the house looked the same. But the house had changed and they both knew it. She noticed the changes in small ways, each one without announcement, each one the kind of thing that speaks more clearly precisely because it says nothing. The coat hook at the staff entrance, the one that had been broken for 2 years and required a specific knowledge of its angle to use without losing your jacket to the floor, was fixed. Properly fixed with a new fitting and a small backing plate, done neatly by someone who had paid attention to a detail that had inconvenienced someone else and had done something about it quietly. The break room, the small plain space near the laundry that the household staff used, had a new kettle and a selection of tea in a small basket, clean and new and simply there. Her salary at the end of the first week was substantially more than it had ever been. No conversation. No ceremony. It was there. She did not thank him directly for any of these things. The language of the new situation had not yet fully formed and she was not someone who used words before she was sure of them. What she did instead was her work, exactly as she had always done it, with the same care and the same precision. And he, for his part, began to do something he had not previously done across 3 years of occupying the same building. He began to notice her. Not as a function of the house but as a person in it. He noticed that she hummed very quietly when she was alone in a room, a private melody with no particular tune, the kind of sound people make when they feel sufficiently safe to be audible without meaning to be. He noticed the way she spoke with ease in the kitchen, with the ease of someone who is genuinely present in a conversation rather than performing the social requirement of it. He noticed the way she read things, labels and notes and the schedules on the board in the kitchen, holding each one at a particular angle that suggested she was actually reading it rather than scanning it, giving everything the full attention it deserved. He began to find himself in the house more frequently on the days she worked. He told himself there were logistical reasons for this. He started asking Adiz about the grandmother after the first specialist appointment. The specialist, it turned out, had adjusted the treatment plan, and the adjustment was already producing small measurable improvements in Mama Ngozi's appetite and the quality of her rest. Adiz reported this with the specific satisfaction of someone who has been invested in the outcome from the beginning and is glad to see the investment justified. The first real conversation, not professional, not logistical, simply human, happened by accident in the way that the real ones always do. He was in the library one evening, sitting in the large chair near the window with a book open on his lap but his eyes somewhere else entirely, looking at the garden with the unfocused gaze of a man whose mind is working on something other than what is in front of him, when Ifeoma passed the open door with her cleaning materials for the upstairs hallway. She would have continued. He said her name. She stopped in the doorway. He said he did not know she was still in the building and she was completely free to continue and he would not be in the way. She said she had only the upstairs hallway left. He said take your time. Then something made him ask, and he asked, how was the appointment? She said the specialist had been thorough. She said the new treatment approach was showing early improvements. She paused. She said the specialist had a green lanyard and her grandmother had told him it was a sensible color, which she wanted him to know was the highest available endorsement her grandmother offered. He looked at her. He asked whether green was categorically approved or approved on a case-by-case basis. She said she believed broadly approved, but that dark blue was an equally safe choice. He looked down at his shirt, which was dark navy. She said he was probably fine. Something happened at the corner of his mouth that was moving in the direction of a smile. She said good night and continued down the hallway. He sat with the conversation after she had gone and found it was not uncomfortable at all. By the third week the conversations were occurring with a frequency that neither of them could honestly attribute entirely to accident, though neither of them said this. They talked in the late afternoon when the house was settling. They talked in the corridor when they happened to arrive at the same place at the same moment. Once they talked in the garden where he had come to sit with his notes and she was collecting leaves that had blown against the fountain, and they talked for several minutes about the bougainvillea and whether the current pruning approach was actually serving the plant or simply imposing a preference on it. She said she thought the plant had its own idea about what it wanted to do and had been doing it quietly regardless of what was being imposed from outside. He said he thought she was probably right. She said she knew she was. He laughed. It was brief and entirely genuine, and it changed his face considerably. She began to understand something about Obiora and Wosu across these weeks that she thought very few people who knew him had ever gotten close enough to understand. He was not at his core a cold person. He was a careful one. And careful and cold are not the same thing, though from the outside they can produce similar surfaces. Cold people do not feel the temperature. Careful people feel it constantly. That is exactly why they move so slowly and so precisely, keeping everything measured and at the correct distance, because somewhere they have learned that things break when you stop being careful. She did not yet know what had taught him that. She recognized the lesson because she had learned a version of it herself, through different circumstances but arriving at the same practice. The specialist appointments continued. The grandmother's condition responded to the new treatment better than the initial projections had suggested. On the good mornings the cough was lighter. On the good afternoons she sat up in her chair by the window reading and monitoring the neighborhood through the glass with her customary sharp attention. She had opinions about almost everything happening on the street and communicated these opinions to Ifeoma each evening at dinner with the comprehensive authority of someone who considers herself a relevant stakeholder in the affairs of everyone within visible range. Obiora came on a Saturday afternoon 4 weeks into the new arrangement. He brought food that Adiz had prepared and flowers from the garden wrapped in paper. He stood at the brown door looking somewhat less certain of himself than he usually appeared. The grandmother received him with the gracious authority of a woman who has decided in advance how she feels about a guest and is now conducting the visit on that basis. She had him seated and in possession of something to eat within 6 minutes. Ifeoma watched from the kitchen shelf while she made tea and watched her grandmother take his measure across the afternoon with the slow systematic attention of someone who takes this work seriously. She watched him listen to the grandmother the way he had listened on the afternoon he came to the doorstep, genuinely and without the performing of patience that is different from actual patience. She watched the grandmother's eyes across the afternoon register what she was seeing and arrive at a conclusion and file it. He came back the following Saturday. And the one after that. He did not announce these visits. He simply appeared at the brown door with something from Adi's kitchen and whatever the garden had offered that week, and the grandmother opened the door and said ah in a tone that suggested she had been expecting him and let him in. Ifeoma found, somewhere in the fourth or fifth Saturday, that she had stopped being surprised by his arrival. That the week had a shape now that included Saturday afternoons. That the sound of his car on the dusty road had become something her body registered below the level of thought, the way you register a familiar quality of light before you have consciously identified what time of day it is. On one of those Saturday afternoons the grandmother said something on the bus home that Ifeoma had not expected to hear and could not unhear once it had been said. She said love was a practical thing. She said it showed up. She said it fixed things without making an announcement about the fixing. She said it asked the right questions and then actually waited for the real answers rather than accepting the ones that were easy to give. She said it did not always look like what people expected it to look like. She said sometimes it looked like a man in a suit who had driven to a street he had never been to before because something was sitting in his chest that logic could not move, who had stood at a dusty doorstep and raised his hand to knock because it was the right thing to do even though it was not the comfortable thing to do. She said do not close yourself to that. She said do not decide it is too complicated or too different or too much of something and not enough of something else. She looked at the road ahead through the bus window. She said just pay attention to what is actually there. Ifeoma said she was not having this conversation. The grandmother said she was not having a conversation. She was making an observation. The distinction, she indicated, was significant. The letter arrived on a cold bright morning. Ifeoma was at the kitchen shelf when she saw it on the small table, a white envelope with her name on the front and the nursing college crest in the corner. She had been preparing for the entrance examination in the early mornings before work, studying at 6 in the morning in the community college 3 bus stops from the apartment, sitting in a cold classroom with other people who wanted to be nurses for different reasons and who all had in common the willingness to be somewhere difficult at 6 in the morning because the thing they wanted mattered enough to make the difficulty worth it. She had not told anyone she had applied. She had been almost superstitious about it, as though naming it too clearly might make it fragile. She picked the envelope up. She put it down. She picked it up again. She opened it. She read the first 3 lines. Then she sat down on the floor of the kitchen, not in a chair but on the floor, because her legs had simply decided that was where she was going and had made the decision independently of her. She sat on the clean-swept floor of her small kitchen with the letter in her hands and read it again and then read it a third time to make sure that the words were saying what they appeared to be saying. Dear Ifeoma, we are pleased to offer you a place in the Bachelor of Nursing program beginning in the first semester. She pressed the letter against her chest. She sat on the floor for a long time in the early morning quiet. Then she stood up. She straightened her apron. She picked up her bag. She had not been late to work in 3 years and she was not going to start today of all days. She told him that evening. She had not planned to. She had intended to tell him when the right moment presented itself and when she had decided what telling him meant and how much space she wanted to give it. But the day had gone on and the news had been sitting in her chest like something warm that kept getting warmer, and by the time the evening arrived she had simply run out of reasons to wait. She knocked on his open office door. He looked up from his screen. She said she had been accepted to the nursing program. She said she had been applying and preparing in the mornings before work and the letter had come that morning and she wanted him to know in case it affected the practical arrangements. He put down what he had been reading. He looked at her. He stood up. He said her name in the way that a person says a name when the name is carrying something significant, with his usual composure gently laid aside for just a moment, just long enough for what was underneath it to be visible. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and was more than a smile. He said she had done the hard part. She said she started in September. He said they would work out the schedule together so that both things were possible and he would not hear an argument about it. She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze with the patient steadiness she had come to understand was not distance but its opposite, attention given so completely that it became stillness. She said thank you. He said she had already done the hard part. She went home and told the grandmother. The grandmother put both hands flat on the small table and looked at the ceiling and said something quietly that was not meant to be heard, and then looked at Ifeoma with her bright sharp eyes and said she was not surprised. She said she had never once been surprised. She enrolled. She went to classes in the early mornings and to work and home to her grandmother and her siblings in the evenings, and she was tired in a way that had a different quality from the tiredness of pure survival. This was the tiredness of building something, of moving towards something, of spending energy on a direction rather than simply on staying upright. She came alive in the classroom in a way she had not anticipated and had almost forgotten was possible. She asked questions and sat with the material and connected things across different weeks of learning, and found that her mind, given the right territory, moved with a speed and a pleasure that was entirely different from the speed of her daily calculations. She told the grandmother everything each evening. The grandmother listened with her whole face. One Saturday Obiora arrived at the brown door and the grandmother opened it and said he was late, which he was not, and let him in with the expression of someone granting an audience. They sat in the small room, the three of them, and the grandmother talked about the neighborhood and the tamarind tree and the family 3 doors down whose situation she had been monitoring with concern, and about a program she had watched on the old television in which people attempted to cook things they had clearly never cooked before, and the results were instructive. Obiora listened and asked questions that told her he was actually listening rather than waiting for his turn. She noted this. She noted everything. She was forming a complete picture, and the picture was arriving at a conclusion, and the conclusion was satisfying. There was an afternoon when Ifeoma came to stand beside him in the garden where he had been sitting alone with his notes, and the bougainvillea was doing exactly what it wanted regardless of what had been decided for it, and they stood together looking at it, and she said she thought the plant had simply decided to be what it was and was not interested in the opinion of anyone who had a different idea about it. He said he had come to respect that quality in things. She said she had always had it but had spent a long time managing it down for the convenience of spaces that were not designed for it. He said he thought that was one of the things he had been wrong about, not just with her but more broadly. That he had built his idea of what a space required around his own preferences and called it a standard when really it was just a preference with more authority than preferences usually get. She said that was an honest thing to say. He said he had been trying to be more honest. She said she had noticed. They stood looking at the bougainvillea for another moment. She said goodnight and went inside. He stayed in the garden until the light had gone completely and sat with the particular feeling of someone who is becoming something they did not know they were in the process of becoming. The thing he needed to say arrived on a Tuesday evening when she knocked on his open office door to say goodnight as she always did. He said he had been thinking about something. She stood in the doorway with her bag on her shoulder and waited. He said these months had been different from the rest of his adult life in a way that he could identify precisely if she was willing to hear it. She said she was willing. He said he had been a different person. Better, he thought, and more honest, and more present in the actual moments of his life rather than moving efficiently through them toward the next task. He said he knew where that had come from. He said he was not speaking from gratitude because gratitude was what he had felt in the early weeks and what he felt now was something entirely different, and he wanted to be precise about the difference because precision was the instrument he had always trusted and he intended to apply it accurately here. He said his life was fuller and truer and more real when she was in it. Not in his house. In his life. He said he would like to build something with her. Something genuine. He said it in the voice of a man who has spent his entire life being certain and is now standing in front of something about which he is completely uncertain and is saying it anyway because saying it is the right thing regardless of the outcome. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the grandmother on the bus saying love is a practical thing. She thought about the coat hook. She thought about the new kettle in the break room. She thought about a man who had driven to a street he had never been to before and stood on a dusty doorstep and heard things through a thin door and knocked anyway. She thought about Saturday afternoons and the tamarind tree conversations and the way he listened with his whole attention, and about the moment in the kitchen on the worst morning of her professional life when he had said today is your last day, and the afternoon when he had come to her door and said I was wrong, and the months of everything that had followed from those 2 moments and what all of it told her about who he was and who he was becoming. She said she was not saying yes because she was grateful. He said he knew. She said she was saying yes because of who he was. Who he was choosing to become. He looked at her and something in his face opened that had been behind the precision and the carefulness all along, something that had always been there and that was now, finally, available to be seen. Yes, he said. She said yes. And the house, which had always been large and perfectly maintained and faultlessly ordered, became for the first time something more than that. It became the place where something real was beginning. They were married the following spring in the church where the grandmother had been attending for 40 years, which meant that every person in the congregation had an opinion about everything and expressed it freely, which was exactly the right atmosphere for the occasion. It was not a large ceremony. Neither of them had any interest in large. There were bougainvillea flowers from the garden, purple and extravagant against the simple setting. Adiz had cooked with the focused ferocity she reserved for things she considered her personal responsibility. The grandmother wore her cream blouse with the small buttons and sat in the front row, and midway through the ceremony said to the person beside her that the groom's tie was an extremely sensible color, which was the highest endorsement she possessed and which she deployed only when she meant it absolutely. Ifeoma walked to the front of the church alone. She had thought about this carefully across several evenings and had arrived at the same conclusion each time. She had always arrived under her own power. She would arrive here the same way. She walked slowly with her chin up, and when she reached him and saw his face, the expression on it, which was nothing like the composed and controlled face she had first known and was instead open and unguarded and entirely present, she knew she had made the right decision in this and in everything. The clinic opened 14 months after the wedding. Not in the expensive part of the city. In the neighborhood where Ifeoma had grown up, 2 bus rides from the dusty road with the pale blue curtains. A converted space, clean and bright and properly equipped, with real doctors and real medicine and a waiting room that was actually comfortable, painted a color that was genuinely calming rather than aspirationally calming. It was staffed properly. It was funded properly. It offered care without the billing conversation that preceded the care, which was the specific thing that had made the difference in Mama Ngozi's last months and which Ifeoma had decided from the beginning was the thing the clinic would do differently from the places she had sat in plastic chairs at 18 and 21 and 23 and listened to what things would cost. It was called the Mama Ngozi Community Health Clinic. The name had been Ifeoma's idea. Obiora had agreed before she had finished proposing it. They stood outside together on the morning of the opening in the early light before the first patients arrived, the two of them, looking at the name on the wall in dark green letters on white. Ifeoma looked at the name and thought about a woman sitting at a small table eating morning porridge and watching her with bright knowing eyes. She thought about hands that were always warm and always reaching. About a voice that said I am not afraid and meant it down to the deepest part of itself. About the tamarind tree and the profound philosophical sorrow of uncollected fruit. About a woman who had given her not just survival but the belief that survival was worth building on. Obiora found her hand and held it. He said she would have approved of the color of the sign. Ifeoma looked at the dark green letters. She said yes. She said she would have called it sensible. He said of course she would. They stood in the growing light, the city beginning its daily conversation around them, the clinic waiting for its first patients, and Ifeoma stood in this moment and understood something she had been learning across all the years and all the days that had brought her to this exact place. That the things you carry can become the things you create. That love, the real kind, the practical kind, leaves something in the world when it goes, something that helps people who will never know the name of the person whose love made it possible. That a single moment of someone deciding to stop and look and actually see who was there had started something that was now going to matter for many years in many lives in a neighborhood that the city had forgotten about. It had all started with 2 bread rolls and a container of rice and 3 pieces of fruit. And one man who had been wrong. And one man who had been willing to say so. And it had led here. To this morning. To this name on this wall. To this hand holding hers. To everything that honest work and a kind heart and the refusal to be made hard by hard things can eventually, if you keep going long enough, produce. If this story reached you tonight, please share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. Share part 1 and part 2 together so they get the full story. Like this video and subscribe to Bishop Tales for powerful emotional stories every single week. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from, and tell us this: what is the most important thing this story taught you? Tell us in the comments because we read every single one and your words matter to us. Thank you for watching both parts of this story. We will see you in the next one. This is Bishop Tales. We will never stop bringing you stories that remind you what people are capable of when they choose to be.